Now, the international peace-building charity Peace Direct is calling on international aid organizations to end what it calls structural racism, which it says infects global development. In a new report titled "It's Time to Decolonize Aid," Peace Direct concluded that the influence of structural racism is so deeply embedded in the everyday culture and working practice of those in the sector that it's affected the way local staff regard their own communities and how they engage with international NGOs. The report suggests that even the language used in the aid system reinforces discriminatory and racist perceptions of non-white populations. The phrase capacity building was cited as one example that conveys the impression that local communities and organizations lack skills, while other terms such as field expert perpetuate images of the global South as uncivilized. Well, for more of this, I'm joined now from Washington by Shannon Paige, Scoville Peace Fellow at Peace Direct and author of the report titled "Time to Decolonize Aid." Thank you very much indeed, Sharon, for joining us. Tell us more briefly about the key findings of your report.
So our report, thank you so much for having me, firstly. And it's a pleasure to be able to talk about this with you today. Our report found that for the past 50, 100 years, the international aid system has understood itself as wholly an agent of good. And in fact, that isn't true. We need to really acknowledge the fact that international aid came out of the colonial period. There are colonial relationships that continue to be replicated or mirrored in financial relationships, and this continues to affect and create dependencies from the global South on the global North that reinforces certain beliefs that those in the global North are more educated, more qualified, better equipped somehow than those in the global South, who happen to usually be people of color, to address issues of development, conflict, and other forms of harm. And that simply isn't true. And so really, for a system that is based on the belief that every human has the right for a life, to lead a life with dignity, how can we understand ourselves as agents of good, agents of change, if we are unwilling to grapple with the fact that our very system is rooted in some deeply problematic beliefs? And how can we begin to change things unless we talk about it? And so that's what we're starting to do here today and in various other avenues.
Well, thanks for setting that out. And what's been the reaction to your report, broadly speaking, from within the international aid industry?
There has been a lot of recognition. I will be frank, when we published the report, I was expecting a fair amount of pushback, and yet found that a number of practitioners, both based in the global North and the global South, recognized what we were talking about, recognized what the quoted participants shared during our consultation back in November of 2020. There is a real problem. People shared personal experiences of either witnessing or they themselves experiencing really intense racism and prejudice because of their backgrounds in the aid system. And that can't continue. So there was a lot of recognition and a lot of interest in continuing the conversation and seeing how we can practically begin to undo some of the existing norms.
And you might have touched on this briefly. I apologize if you already have, but tell us more about the evidence you used to support the findings that you published in that report.
So in November of 2020, Peace Direct, along with our partner organizations who co-led this initiative, so ADESO, the Alliance for Peace Building, and Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, we held a 3-day online consultation on a platform called the Platform for Dialogue, which is a text-based platform that requires low bandwidth to make sure that it is as accessible and inclusive as possible. And we began to ask questions and to have discussions on structural racism, the colonial legacy of the aid system, and on solutions for how the system could better itself and become something that is truly inclusive, truly equitable, and truly leading to a better world. And so that was our process. And so we ended up with 156 participants from all over the world, a mix of academics and on the ground practitioners, as well as people who are based in various headquarters. And so it was a really lively discussion over those 3 days.
And your report points out that structural racism benefits organizations in the global north and also those from the global south who know how to play the game, as you put it. Tell us more about what you mean by that.
Well, I think I can safely use myself as an example. I am originally from the Caribbean, but I live in the United States right now. I speak English with an American accent, and those have afforded me certain privileges. The fact that my organization is willing to be represented by me on, here today, that's indicative of privilege that I have because I am understood as palatable, because I am able to meet certain criteria. There are ways that organizations based in the North inadvertently exclude those who have less access and less privilege. What space are we creating for people who do not speak one of the major languages of the international aid system, by which I mean English, French, Spanish, and increasingly Arabic? We don't have opportunities for them. How are we inviting people who maybe have non-traditional education pathways? We usually are not. We usually aren't even able to reach out to them because of how rigid our structures are, our hiring structures are, because of how rigid our relationship to project design and project management is. And so really from the very start, from project conception to monitoring and evaluation, we have failed. We have fundamentally failed to include a diversity of voices. And increasingly, there are people like me, people of color, Black people who are able to fill in those roles, but we haven't addressed the fundamental challenges and issues and limitations of our sector.
And how can changes in your assessment be made? And are those changes or recommendations included in the report that you published?
Yes. So the recommendations in the report are actually divided according to, so there's a section that's focused on INGOs, because as an INGO ourselves, we felt it important to really position ourselves as not necessarily leading, but really understanding that we have also benefited from structural racism and trying to undo the harm that continues as long as we refuse to acknowledge it. And so the recommendations are divided into 3 sections for INGOs, for funders, and more broadly for those involved in the international aid system. And then there's a 3rd section that I personally think is arguably the most important section, and that is for individuals. And so these recommendations are tailored to those different groups to see what changes need to be made. And so some of the recommendations include things such as minding your language. You mentioned this in the introduction, but really and truly, the words that we say matter, and they create the realities that we live in. And so really, when we talk about certain communities as being untrustworthy, what do we mean by untrustworthy? Where is the stereotype or the assumption that those communities are untrustworthy? Where is that coming from? And really interrogating that. When we assume that a young person who just recently graduated from a prestigious university here in the global north, when we assume that they are more qualified than somebody who's been living in the region and who has been doing whatever development, humanitarian, or peace building work for decades, when we assume that they are more qualified, what are we actually saying about the value and the presumed accomplishments of those in the North? And so those recommendations cover a broad stroke of things, but really, I would encourage everybody to read the report and especially to spend some time looking over those recommendations for individuals, which invite a lot of reflection and being willing to pass the mic when appropriate.
Well, that's very interesting, and would like to talk with you some more. So please stay with us. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Shannon Paige, Scoville Peace Fellow at Peace Direct and author of Time to Decolonize Aid. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, according to a new study by the British international peace-building charity Peace Direct, global charities have a serious problem with race. The report says that structural racism is reinforcing colonial dynamics in global development. In other words, there is a colonial legacy that's inherent within the system of aid. Much of the work and the values that inform the work that international aid agencies do is rooted in Western values and knowledge systems, which means essentially that many programs inadvertently create a standard based on the West that communities in the global South are required to meet. Thus, by default, local knowledge is devalued. And Shannon Paige, Scoville Peace Fellow at Peace Direct and author of To Decolonize Aid, is still with me from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And there are other issues or barriers that you found in the international aid system that represent a perpetuation and reinforcement of these colonial dynamics in global development. For example, the fact that Black, Asian and other minorities in the UK, for example, are said to be underrepresented in the workforce, and when they do get work, they say they are subjected to racism in their jobs. I wonder if that's the same experience you get in the United States where you are.
Absolutely. By and large, I would say across the globe, we have an issue with underrepresented communities, minority communities being employed either tokenistically or by which I mean very rarely do we see people of color, especially Black people, especially people of color who are also women or who may be disabled in various ways. Very rarely do we see them in leadership positions. And then I think in the United States in particular, we have our own history and challenges with race and inequities, but it is a global phenomenon that you see not only on the global stage, but within these international organizations. They tend to replicate a lot of the same dynamics that they then approach communities in the global South with.
Well, I mean, I'm wondering if this underrepresentation of ethnic minorities in charity workforces, I mean, what difference that makes in real terms. Can any charitable organization say that they are fit for purpose when they don't reflect the communities they purport to serve?
I would argue no. I would argue that a lot of charities really have lost sight of why it is that we exist. We have lost sight of the fact that ultimately our role is only to serve insofar as we are useful. And when we are no longer useful, when other communities are able to address the harm that they are experiencing, be it environmental conflict or whatever else, that is ideally when we no longer need to exist. We get to take a step back and say, great, we trust you. We know that you're capable, because fundamentally, our goal should be harm reduction. Our goal should be the protection of human life. It shouldn't be to enrich ourselves. It shouldn't be to raise the profiles of our organizations or our own individual profiles. Ultimately, we are here to help keep people safe and to help people live with dignity. And we should want people to be able to accomplish those things without us, because otherwise we have failed. And I think we have lost sight of that in an attempt to create an entire system, an entire professional industry around charity and around aid.
And now that we have you on air, tell us a bit about your organization, Peace Direct, and give us examples where a local peace-building organization supported by Peace Direct has been able to achieve results and has managed to resolve conflicts, basically.
So the thing about conflict is it's incredibly complex. And so conflict resolution in its entirety, that is something that we still, I think, unfortunately have many years to see. But Peace Direct works with a number of amazing organizations all around the world. And off the top of my head, I can think of a conversation I had with one of our partners recently, based in the Democratic Republic of Congo, who was sharing how they wanted to incorporate youth in a number of their efforts. And so they found that it was really challenging to get local politicians to really listen to youth. And so they started inviting youth to speak on various radio shows and, really engaging youth in various parts of the community. And not only did that help create a sense of purpose for a lot of those young people who might otherwise have been, drawn into various conflicts by various militia groups, but it did then create a culture of valuing young people, and that then was able to have certain local politicians listen to them and start to hear them. And so we work with so many organizations who have found ways to, through community building and relationship building, to be very, very intelligent and to promote advocacy and to promote peace. And so I'm just incredibly fond of all of the organizations that we work with, and so honestly honored to get whenever I get to hear their story.
So basically, I mean, from actively contributing to conflict, you're able, because I read quite a bit of some of your literature, you're able to get local people to become active peace builders. I mean, that sounds quite remarkable.
I think it is. I think it's something that really speaks to the fact that those who are most proximate and most affected by conflict are not just passively sitting back and watching conflict happen. All of the organizations that we partner with, when we enter into relationships with them, they have already been doing this work and in all likelihood would continue to do this work without us. We are just able to provide some support and to raise their profiles so that they can build connections with one another if they're geographically proximate, and so that the global community is aware of them and can also support them and support their efforts. Because we believe that those on the ground have unique skills. And we don't just believe this, our research has shown this, that people who are living in those regions who are affected by conflict have an intimate understanding of the challenges of the culture of the community, have unique social relations that they can pull on when it comes to community building, and really are able to design and implement programs and projects that are uniquely relevant to the culture and the specific context that they're functioning in. And so our whole goal is to continue to promote that and to continue highlighting the amazing work of people and to continue insisting that those on the ground, those from those contexts, are already doing the work. So it is the role of the international community not to guide them, but to see where they can assist.
And let me just take you back to your report, which was the original premise of this chat. The report confirming in many ways that many people in the international aid sort of structure or some of the practices in that structure are inherently racist. Do you think the international charities and the people who run those organizations accept this about themselves and their agencies? We've got about a minute.
I would say, I think a lot of people don't want to, because to bring it back to the central point is we enter charity work because we care about other people and because a lot of us quite naively want to make the world a better place. I think it's really difficult to sit with that truth and the coexisting reality that organizations that we may have looked up to our whole lives, organizations that we may belong to, have caused harm. And so my invitation to anyone struggling with sitting with structural racism and its existence and its effects on the system would be, if you want to truly change things, if you truly want to help others and change the system, that you have to start with acknowledging the harm that you have done and the ways that you have benefited. And it is deeply uncomfortable, but also deeply necessary.
Okay, I want to thank you very much indeed, Shannon, for the time that you've taken to talk with us. Shannon Paige is a Scoville Peace Fellow at Peace Direct and author of Time to Decolonize. And she was talking to me from Washington.